Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our fifth installment in the AHA Foundation's six-part webinar series, which is about this ideological capture of American K through 12 education. If this is your first time tuning in, I'm Susanna McIntyre. I'm the Development Associate here at the AHA Foundation, and I also do the advocacy coordination for our Clarity Coalition program, and also the moderator of the series we're doing. We launched this series because we've seen a clear pattern. AHA's had a history of working in the university space, but it's become increasingly clear to us that these ideologically driven agendas are reshaping classrooms for much younger children, and that we actually need to begin tackling this problem sooner. And this is oftentimes happening completely without parents' knowledge and their consent. And so throughout this series, we've walked through the problem, how these classrooms have become a battleground for these agendas, how postmodern theories and activist frameworks have entered educational schools, and then how those ideas have trickled down into our children's curriculum. But this session, we have concluded, unpacking the problem. Now we want to tackle what can be done about the problem, because people have been constantly asking us, well, what can I do? What can I do? How can we push back? And where do parents and community members actually have power? So joining us today are two experts who've worked on the front lines of this fight. I'm so happy that we have them with us. We have Nicole Neily, who is the president and founder of Defending Education. She's also the founder of Speech First, which is a national campus free speech organization, and has worked at the Independent Women's Forum and the Cato Institute. And not only is she the mother of two school-aged children, but she also recently testified before Congress alongside one of our previous panelists, Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky. So I actually highly encourage all our attendees to go watch that testimony before the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, if you haven't seen it so far. And we are also joined by Rebecca Chagales, who is the acting director of the Camera Education Institute. And she is a former educator. So, informed by her experience as an educator in Virginia, she has shifted her focus to combating anti-Semitism and ideological bias in K through 12 education. Rebecca also co-founded United Against Anti-Semitism and has been featured in outlets like White Rose Magazine and Minding the Campus for her advocacy and research. Thank you both so much, as always, for taking the time to share your expertise with our audience and supporters here at the AHA Foundation. And with that, let's get started. So I wanted to begin this session with starting with the basics, because I think for some people, the structure of how the school system works and curricula decisions can be kind of opaque. So what exactly is the role of a school board in shaping what gets taught in the classroom? And Rebecca, could you walk us through how school boards influence curriculum decisions, textbook adoptions, district policies, etc., and how much power do they actually have?
Sure. Thank you, Susanna, for having me on today. I think I should start with what power the national government has and kind of work our way down so parents truly understand kind of the role of these different entities in their child's education. So first of all, the national government actually has very little oversight over K through 12 schools, and that's often very confusing for parents because they tend to think that there's some kind of national standards or curriculum, but in fact, there's none of that. And also, there's very little funding, relatively speaking, when you look at the other funding sources, which are the state and at the local level. The national government does provide funding in certain specified areas, mainly like special education. And then there's the Office of Civil Rights, which provides oversight in terms of discrimination in public schools and other areas. So then you have the states. What the states do is they provide standards of education, and that can look very different state to state. Those standards can be very specific in some states, to the point where the state is even prescribing teacher notes and activities and resources that every teacher is supposed to use, to standards that are extremely vague and widely open to interpretation, which obviously is where a lot of problems can come in. Some states also mandate state testing, although very few do now. I think it's something like eight, maybe even less. So we've even seen states, with the influence of the teachers' unions, which will probably come up in conversation, just recently in the state of Massachusetts, advocate for getting rid of more state testing. So, they're removing methods of accountability for parents. So the states provide those curriculum standards, which again can be quite vague. They also provide, teacher licensing, so they're overseeing that aspect of it as well. And then you have the school boards. And so most of the power when we're talking about K through 12 is local and it's in the hands of the school board. What the school board does is it's managing the budget. And if you want to know what your school district values, look at the budget. If they're increasing spending on reading and math specialists, then you know what they value. If they're increasing spending on the DEI office and your DEI staff are the best paid people in your school district, then you know what they value. So the school board holds the power of the purse. They have the power to fund and defund programs, speakers, contracts, curriculum, you name it. The school board also, because of that, power to sign off on everything. Any new curriculum that's getting approved has to go through the school board for final approval. Any textbook selections also have to go through the school board for final approval. So there's an enormous amount of power there just with managing the budget. The other area that the school board oversees are regulations and policies that determine maybe how those books are getting chosen in the first place, what standards are being used to evaluate textbooks and novels and other readings, and then also regulations regarding teaching controversial issues, teacher impartiality, even things down to student behavior. What, is a matter of free speech versus hate speech in the school. All those things get ultimately defined and approved by the school board.
Wow. So, well, which leads me to my next question, because I think this is where a lot of power struggle comes in that confuses a lot of parents is if this is the case about the role responsibility of the school board, then what role and what power did the unions and these external consultants and these activist nonprofits play in curricula? Because it seems like they are able to throw their weight around even though it's not their place.
Yeah, oh, should I?
Go ahead.
No, I think the answer is a disproportionate amount. And just to sort of dovetail with what Rebecca was saying before, I think it's worth noting that there has been tremendous consolidation in the number of school districts across the country over the past 100 years. You look back to like the 1939, I think there were about 119,000 school districts in the country. As of now, there are about 13,500. And so you think clearly there are more students now being served by a smaller number of school administrators. And so that's how you end up with a district like Fairfax County, which is the 11th biggest school district in the country. It has a budget of $3.5 billion. It has 25,000 employees. That's bigger than like many multinational corporations. And so that power then to make these decisions on behalf of thousands, hundreds of thousands of students is concentrated in the hands of what is largely an unaccountable small group of people. So when you get up and give your 2 minutes to present at a school board and say, hey, I have some real concerns about these programs, about the curriculum you've chosen, to them, it's just like, okay, cool, pound sand, because they're really not accountable to you because they have so many other constituents. I think, when we look at how and where the curriculum is coming from, certainly we know that for decades there have been outside groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, like the Middle Eastern Children's Alliance that have created curriculum and have put it online. And, we hear constantly, from people like Randy Weingarten that teachers are underpaid, they're overworked. Some of this is at the union's behest because they're putting all these other mandates on teachers that like teachers have to also be gender support transition counselors and punching bags. But that aside, teachers clearly they have to be in the classroom for the course of the day, and then they have to come up with a lesson plan. And even though the district might say use this curriculum, it's up to an individual teacher how that plays out in their classrooms. And so what we have seen, and Robert Pondisio at AEI has done a lot of good work about this, is they're usually, for a lot of teachers, is not some grand plan of, making, getting things into classrooms. Very often, frighteningly often, there are teachers that are going online at 10 o'clock the night before and just looking for a workshop or a lesson plan or like a worksheet or something that they can pull off. There are sites like Teachers Pay Teachers where if somebody has made a curriculum and they can just use that and they can pay a couple bucks to another teacher that has come up with something. Um, so the fact that there is sort of this large, sort of outside, unaccountable cottage industry is something that I think is kind of fascinating because you as like, I mean, I think back to before I had kids and sort of knew how the school system works. You assume that a lot of this is very planned out, at the beginning of the school year, this is what they must do during the summer. And somewhat frighteningly, it is completely not what happens. And what we have seen just in our public records request in looking at how ideas are disseminated between schools, between school districts, there are these unions that are being used as almost super highways to share information between members to push stuff out through these listservs of teachers. Organizations like the Zinn Education Project claim to have, tens of thousands of educators within their network. I read something from the Southern Poverty Law Center ages ago, and they said they had about 400,000 educators in their network. You don't build up those numbers just in the wake of George Floyd. That is a network that you have been cultivating, programming, having events for decades. And so I think, while we're talking about this now, I think it's important to know that like we are sort of late to the party almost in identifying and realizing what exactly has been taking place behind closed doors for decades.
Yeah. Rebecca, what is your perspective on that and the role of the unions or these, activist nonprofits and the influence they have on curricula? I mean, what has you seen in your experience?
Sure. So I think unfortunately, we have a problem within the teaching profession that not every teacher is as well educated as we would hope they would be. And so to Nicole's point of them looking things up the night before, I ran a history department. I supervised student teachers for a university at one point. And what is shocking and disappointing is that not every teacher is well versed in their subject material. And so when they're looking things up the night before, it's because they don't really know the subject themselves. And that makes them also susceptible to a lot of the ideological agendas that are out there. So when they start Googling, they come to, I need a lesson on the civil rights movement or something. They can Google and Zen Ed, which is, the social justice, so-called curricula organization, their work will come up and it's accessible and free. And so the teacher uses it. And so there's an element of this that is just kind of ignorance, where teachers are bringing these materials into classroom. Of course, though, there is a large and growing number of teachers who see their job and their role as a teacher as one to indoctrinate, not to help students to improve their learning and to be educated and to, be able to be successful as adults. But they have an agenda and they're looking to use their classroom as, vehicles for, pushing that agenda forward. So you'll see the union and these other organizations. I mean, frankly, when I was a teacher, I used to get magazines that I never signed up for, including the Southern Poverty Law Center. I don't know how they got my name, but I was getting their teaching tolerance at the time, that's what it was called, magazine. So you wind up on these lists of these organizations. If you join the professional organizations for your teaching profession, whether it's like the National Council for Teachers of English, NCTE, National Council for Social Studies, if you look through what it is that they are producing in their publications, in their annual meetings, there is an agenda. And these organizations, whether it's the unions, organizations like Zen Ed, Rethinking Schools, Southern Poverty Law Center, or the professional organizations, oftentimes it's the same individuals who are working at all of these different organizations. And they're part of this larger network that is seeking to use children to advance their political agenda.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think a lot of it is self-reinforcing, right? When you see and hear the same thing over and over again. And Rebecca, as you had mentioned before, with the school boards controlling funding, we often see school districts bringing in outside consultants for professional development. I mean, think I, as a parent, like my kid's school is closed once a month for teachers to do professional development. And when that happens, you have to figure out what you're going to do with your kid for the day, put them into it. a day camp, but you sort of assume that your teachers are learning how to be better educators. Our organization has filed public records requests. We get tips from parents all the time and teachers who say, this is the person that they brought in. It's the person who made all the teachers do a privilege walk and tell us all that, whiteness is a deal with the devil kind of thing. That's what finite district resources are being spent on. And these are not trivial sums of money. A couple years ago, we did something called a consultant report card, looking at who are these firms? What kinds of amounts do they charge? I mean, tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes used with Title I funding that's supposed to be helping low income students learn better. There is a teacher professional development grant line item. I want to say it's Title II. I can't remember off the top of my head. So things like this where money that has been allocated by the federal government or the state government or even just local taxes is actually going to undermine a lot of the things that many of us as parents and citizens, I think, believe in.
I know I've seen some of these consultancy fees, like the check is like abusive. Like it's insane. Um, so now that we understand a little bit more about the roles and who's involved in the structure, I think one thing that is a concern to many parents is I'd love to get your perspective on what are the early warning signs that a district is going down the wrong path?
I mean, I have a whole list of questions that parents should be asking of their schools. And a lot of these things have been going on for at least a decade or more, and parents are completely unaware. So, questions that parents should be asking. Does your child read an entire novel, an entire book as part of their coursework, or are they reading excerpts? And the reason that that question is so important is because it goes to the issue of expectations. There's just been a lowering of expectations in the schools. And so this is really at the heart of this debate over merit versus equity. And then linked to that too is what are they reading? There's only so much time in the day. So if they are adding things in that are problematic, not only is that an issue in its own right, but they're taking something out at its expense. And so what are they taking out? Are students still reading Shakespeare? Is your child reading, Hawthorne and Twain and Hemingway? Are they reading the Federalist Papers? Are they reading Lincoln's Second Inaugural Address? Because if they're not reading these foundational texts in Western values and American values and history, then these are kids who are going to grow up being very susceptible to the ideas of Marxism and decolonization, and that resistance is anything that they is a perfectly viable option to any idea that they disagree with, because they're no longer rooted in Western values. And so that's a big kind of warning sign that the school is undertaking this kind of ideological change before they even kind of introduce the ideas themselves. And then the other thing to look for too is obviously, when these ideas start emerging, sometimes they come in as classes that are electives, even if they're not mandated at the state level, for example, like ethnic studies in California. But when you have courses that are identity based, that are either elective or mandated, because sometimes they are now mandated district to district. And those courses focus on not teaching history, but they teach the ideas of, settler colonialism, for example, as something that is beyond scrutiny. And to even question this, you get labeled a racist. That's a huge warning sign that your district has now just kind of gone off the rails.
Yeah.
I think a lot of families really had no idea what had been taking place in schools until COVID, because we have seen sort of a lot of this stuff come in at a time when schools were also going digital. I mean, I think back to when I was growing up, there were hard copy textbooks. You would get papers home. Now you don't. And I remember one of the first things that we wrote up when we were launching Defending Education was a teacher actually had sent us a clip of, it was an email for an administrator to teachers in a district outside of St. Louis. And she said, here's how you keep things off of Canvas so parents don't complain, right? Because I, as a parent, like
Wow.
I can log into Schoology and I can see sort of what my kids are doing for the day. But I have found just the lack of transparency to me feels very fishy, right? Like where there's smoke, there's fire. I would get, when my kids were in public school, an email from the teacher once a week, today we learned about the 60s. Okay, well, What part of the 60s did you spend the week talking about the Beatles or did you spend the week talking about the Weather Underground? Those are very different things. And the fact that families, for the most part, have really been kind of held at arm's length to me is a big red flag. Families should be partners in a child's success and education. I, as a mother, I want to compliment what my kids are learning in school. If they're doing a lesson about World War II and Germany, we'll make schnitzel, we'll watch The Great Escape. I want to bring those lessons to life. But when I am not told what is being discussed, what is being read, I am not able to help out. And then, so it's the child cannot succeed as well because they're not being supported by all the people in their families' lives. Even years after COVID, a lot of schools still don't allow families into the school buildings. It's very hard to schedule a parent-teacher conference. The issue of curriculum transparency has come up a lot. We file public records requests for things, but we are regularly given estimates in the hundreds or thousands of dollars from school districts to have access to material that you as a parent actually under the Federal Protection of People Rights Amendment are able to read. So you should be allowed to go in. Often districts make it very difficult for a family to know that. They'll say, well, you can come in on Thursday between 2 and 3 p.m. That's burdensome on families, particularly people who are working. You're not allowed to copy things because they say, well, this is copyright. Clearly, you as a mom are not going to go turn around and like sell the information online. You just want to know what your kids are learning. And so I think just sort of the sneaky behavior to me is also a big question. When we were launching, 2021, 22, there were a lot of terms that were being used at the time that I think people really cottoned to, right? It was anti-racism, it was equity. We're now seeing sort of all of that language shift, right? It's not first we were told for years there was no such thing as critical race theory in schools. It's culturally responsive teaching, right? Social emotional learning, right? And now social, that's turning into, positive behavior, right? And so it's just this sort of fluffy, innocuous language that doesn't mean anything. And at the end of the day, think you have our kids for 7 or 8 hours a day. How are you making use of that time? If you're spending 4 of the 7 hours talking about big feelings and social emotional learning time, you're not reading, you're not writing, you're not doing science, you're not doing math. But even in a lot of those classes, I mean, we have seen this massive push out of California, thanks to Stanford, of something called equitable math. So it's just even disciplines that you think would or should be serious are also being hijacked. And so it's, I think we tell parents all the time, if you have a bad gut feeling about something, you're almost certainly probably right.
Yeah. I mean, it's any parent I think would have this internal reaction about something being hidden from them regarding their child. I mean, it's unconscionable. Um, so this is actually very interesting. And I want to toss this first to Rebecca and Nicole. You're more than welcome to jump in. I just know that Rebecca has recently been working on a report regarding the school district in Philadelphia. So I wanted to touch base on a little bit on what geographic areas of the country are we seeing the most aggressive overreach in school content or the most egregious examples. So Rebecca, I'll toss to you first.
Right. I mean, in general, the blue zones are the red zones. Those are the areas that are kind of on fire. But it goes beyond the state, obviously, because it's all of our urban areas and then the surrounding suburban areas because it spreads out from the city as well. And you'll even see that things that may have started in the city, for example, will then, it'll trickle out and you'll have the same type of courses now being offered in the suburban areas. And so you have to kind of consider that whole area as, kind of a spectrum of extremes. In terms of, where there's this kind of most aggressive, our big cities are obviously the worst. If you think of Philadelphia in particular, I tend to look at that as being one of the most egregious across the country. And in part, that's because of a lot of historical context that needs to be considered when you're looking at why the state of education may be so bad in a particular place. In the city of Philadelphia, you have a history of the Black nationalist movement, and most people are just not very familiar with what that means and what that's about. When they think of the civil rights movement, they have a limited understanding that we're talking about Martin Luther King and the content of our character. But the civil rights movement continued on after his murder, and there's a whole other kind of stream of it that really became dominant. And Philadelphia is one of the cities in the United States that really the Black nationalism took hold. And so it's not surprising then that the school district has this almost obsession with race and decolonization and racialized capitalism. These are words that appear throughout the curriculum. So much so that after George Floyd, like we saw across school districts, across the country, were making statements that they were going to become anti-racist and they were going to dismantle their systems of oppression in their schools. Well, you have to wonder, like, what were they doing? If the school was oppressive before that, like, what was going on? But post George Floyd, what the school district of Philadelphia did, what that meant in practical terms was they rewrote their curriculum. And so their history curriculum, instead of a chronological approach to history, is a thematic approach. And the themes that they focus on are the so-called sins of Western civilization, capitalism, racism, and settler colonialism. And they handpick examples to reinforce the, kind of evilness of these themes. And what that also means is that there are whole topics in history that students are never introduced to by the time they graduate from the school district of Philadelphia. So that's probably one of the most extremes where, a student can graduate. And first of all, too, something parents should be looking at are what are the reading scores, for your school district? What are the math scores? Because when they're doing all these other things where they're spending money and they're spending the budget, it's coming at the expense of something else. And certainly learning about, decolonization and resistance is not helping, any child learn to read better. But you're seeing more and more of this across the country. And so they can graduate now and have never learned about the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the Holocaust. There are whole major events that are just absent now from student understanding. And so that's extremely dangerous if we're looking at what is the next generation of voters going to be determining for the fate of our country.
Yeah. And just to echo what Rebecca said, I mean, certainly, I guess we sort of know, like, I sort of assume, yeah, like California, like the schools are rotten. New York, they're rotten. But my organization, Defending Education, has, as we get tips and as we file public records requests and find things about different school districts, we have been putting it on a map on our website, our indoctrination map, because we wanted to show policymakers this is not just a blue state problem. This is everywhere. This is in red states. Just because you live in Texas or Oklahoma, or you send your child to a private school, you are not safe. This is in parochial schools. This is in Jewish day schools. This is very much an issue where the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. You cannot drop your child off at the schoolhouse gate and assume, look, like, I think this is fine. Like, we pay, like, we live in a conservative suburb. It's okay. No, you have to look at what's going on, because also there can be, one bad apple spoiling the barrel. We have seen lots of incidents where one teacher will start to bully other teachers and, trying to push them, particularly, I think, most recently, issues of the Israel Gaza war have come to light, where we have seen teachers, really start to aggressively, throw accusations and cow and silence and shut down their peers. A couple years ago, we saw a webinar from Bellevue Public Schools in Washington State, and there was a younger teacher that was on. It was during COVID, all the schools were shut. It was a professional development thing that had been recorded. And there was some older teachers that were like, I'm not super comfortable about the direction the race stuff is going. And the younger teacher started yelling at her and saying, either you evolve or dissolve. And, you could just see this like older woman sort of shut down and shrink. And you thought, she's never going to speak up again. She almost certainly is going to just take early retirement, because nobody wants to be subject to that kind of professional abuse from their colleagues. And so just again, this is absolutely everywhere. It's not just like, sorry, California, like we're going to push you off into the Pacific.
Sorry. Took me off guard. Um, so along those lines, what are the best ways for parents to follow the money, so to speak, and expose the questionable spending or expose the partner organizations that are influencing this curricula?
Yeah, it's great, and I feel like we have created so many sort of investigative journalists around the country over the past couple of years. You see memes on Instagram where people talk about, who needs the FBI, when you have like a group of girlfriends trying to identify like who somebody's new boyfriend is, and like, okay, I saw his sister and this was his job in high school. It's kind of like that because when you start to see and hear and realize something fishy is going on in my kid's school, I mean, it's one of those like, you have activated this network of like protective mama bears. So, there have been these like, odd handouts. Like, we would get tips from parents about like, hey, the gender unicorn, like, what is this? And then the people would look and say, oh, well, this was created by this organization. This was pushed into my school by this. But I think one really good place to start to look at is district school board minutes because they have to vote on expenditures. And so you will see, wow, you just spent $40,000 bringing in that consultant when I don't know why you would bring in someone to talk about racial equity when our literacy rate for our district is 35%. It feels like we should be focusing on other things, right? But just to see kind of what the actual expenditures are. Every district has to allocate and make these things public, or public school districts do, obviously. But we also, I mean, I am like a shark with like blood in the water. I love to file public records requests. And so we have a guide on our website where we teach people how to do that. Every state has a different state law on public transparency. And so I encourage anybody who is interested in learning how to do so to reach out to me. My colleagues will walk you through. We can give you language at like, you can cite this is the Utah state code for the grandma. This is the right to know law in Pennsylvania. Because once you start to, when you put those things in and say, you have 5 days to respond under state law, you have 10 days, like it sort of puts the district on notice that you know what your rights are so that they don't try and gaslight you and sort of sweep it under the rug and sort of ignore you. This is actually how we were able to uncover the collusion between the Biden administration and the National School Boards Association is, I mean, I'm still waiting on stuff that I'd asked the federal government for in 2022, but school districts themselves and the board members of the NSBA, their districts were bound by state law, and many states have, you must respond within 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, 10 days. And so the clock is ticking from the minute they receive your request. But just if you see something, you can ask for correspondence from a teacher. You can ask for district administrators or board members correspondence about things. Very frequently, people in the public education system do not think of themselves as state employees. They are, and that means that they are subject to transparency. They are spending your tax dollars and they are subject to public oversight. A handful of states do have laws where, like in Virginia, you must be a Virginia state resident to request files from a Virginia institution. But again, that is something where if you are trying to get something in another state, reach out to me because we can figure out a way to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, do you have anything you wanted to add on tactics that people can use
Yeah,
to expose this?
I think another, in addition to the public records requests, the social media of your school
Mm.
staff is really important to follow. You will unfortunately find that many of your teachers are Hamas supporters, and involved in all kinds of activities that really question whether they should be around children. And so you can capture their social media, and it's important to screenshot and document and take video to verify that this is in fact them. But when you do that, these are things that can be used in filing complaints against their teaching license, making complaints with the school board. You can also find out too that, these are not kind of one-offs usually. It's not that you have just one rogue teacher in your school district who's just doing their own thing and it's like, okay, we can contain that problem and deal with it. Usually that teacher is connected to the larger network of activists in the country. And so if you look at their social media, you will often find that they are working with very, very questionable people. They are making speeches at events that are, in the case of fighting anti-Semitism, you could have a teacher in a district who is speaking at American Muslims for Palestine, AMP, which is under investigation in the state of Virginia for its ties to Hamas. And so, why is somebody like that teaching children? Looking into those records, and oftentimes too, these teachers, it's all public. They're not hiding it. Sometimes they will, and there are ways to go about finding it because they'll kind of let it slip somewhere in a public forum, and then you can find out what their name is for social media. So you have to, again, it's like Nicole says, parents have to become kind of the investigators of these issues. No one else is really doing this work. Our organizations are supporting parents, and we do this sort of thing, but it's often parents bringing things to us that we can then further pursue with our resources and support the work that the parents are doing on the ground.
Yeah, I think
Fantastic.
unfortunately, like sort of with the decline of the news industry, like we have to step into the void. There used to be local news outlets that would attend school board meetings, that would file these public records requests. I mean, I cannot tell you the amount of times I have had a reporter say, "Hey, could you file a FOIA about blank?" And I think to myself, "Oh my gosh, you guys, this is what you used to do." But if reporters are expected to churn out 3 or 4 articles a day, they don't have time to like do the deep investigation. And so sometimes we just have to kind of hand them something in a silver plate, which like is a little bit irritating. But at the end of the day, sunshine is the best disinfectant because when that stuff gets out, not only does it shame and humiliate those school districts, and I have done follow-ups to some of the things we have done, and they freak out when they get a media request. I will let you know that. But it not only puts that district in the hot seat, but then it also puts everybody else on notice, other districts that are using a similar, program, material, curriculum. Oh my gosh, like that could be us in the news next week. Let's think about this. And I think it encourages administrators to exercise greater oversight about what is taking place in their classrooms. Every principal should know what lessons their teachers are using. They should be walking around. Board members also should know what's going on so that when they are asked for comment, they can say, here's the process in getting materials or, picking lessons. But when things are sort of happening willy-nilly, which is how they kind of have been to date, that's when people are caught like they're blindsided, and that's when problems happen.
Mm. So, kind of along those lines, this is a little bit of a two-part question. But what are the most common tactics used to shut down and marginalize parents that raise these concerns? And then how can parents make an impact if they feel like they're outnumbered or being dismissed? I'll go to Rebecca first.
Well, I mean, Nicole can talk a lot about this, I'm sure. Is one of the most common delay tactics is not responding to those public records requests or charging exorbitant fees. One quick way, just to address that, and I'm sure Nicole can add to it, but is that parents have addressed it, that I've worked with, is they start a GoFundMe and they fund those public records requests themselves by just asking parents to donate 20 bucks or so. And so all of a sudden they have this huge pot where they can go after the school district and keep, doing these public records requests, working with the media to publicize what's going on. Um, when parents are outnumbered, which particularly for the Jewish community, that is something that I think tends to silence a lot of parents because we're already a minority, and then you're dealing with a situation where this ideology frames Jews as the oppressors. We are now being framed as white supremacists, and so when we speak out about it, there is this great risk of, being called a racist, an Islamophobe, and there's fear of retaliation. And so, one of the ways that we can work to get around that is look at who are our natural allies in this fight, particularly in the fight against Islamist extremism. And so if you look at who the Islamists are also targeting, it's Christians, it's African Christians in particular. When we look at what's going on a daily basis on the continent there, that gets no coverage here in the United States, it's Hindus. And so when we reach out to those communities, we find that there's a lot of common ground. But what I advise parents to do when you're trying to find those common allies is not just reach out to them and say like, oh, hey, we should have lots in common here. The same, people hate us, but it's to have a specific ask. And so, for example, I had a community that had a textbook issue. In how the textbook was writing about the Middle East conflict. And they didn't feel comfortable going to the school district and making a complaint because this was a school district that had a lot of active involvement from CARE. And so they knew there was going to be some, really big backlash. So I asked them if there was a sizable Hindu community. And they said there is. And I said, great, bring the textbook to them and have them look at the parts on Hinduism and India and Pakistan and see what they think of it. And so they did that, and they returned to me and they said they were outraged. They couldn't believe, what was left out, the perspective that was given. And so what happened there is there was a specific action that those two groups of parents took together. And so now it was not just the Jewish community speaking out, it was not just the Hindu community speaking out. It was a larger group of parents now approaching the superintendent and the school board saying, look, we have a problem. And you tend to get taken more seriously when you do that. So it's not just about finding allyship, it's finding the action you can take together and working together towards that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Nicole, would you like
I
to add?
think, yeah, just another common tactic is just it is those ad hominem attacks. I mean, it is calling people racist, bigots, transphobes, xenophobes, right? Nobody wants to be called a name. And I think that is where, we saw a lot of reticence from parents to get involved initially after COVID because people were scared, right? It was after George Floyd. You said the wrong thing, and suddenly you're the neighborhood QAnon guy for the rest of your life. And I think a lot of people are very uncertain. Well, you're the educators, you're in the system, you have a PhD, you're the superintendent. Like, I don't know. Like, I sort of got queasy when I read the handout, but I should probably keep my mouth shut. And so it was sort of weaponizing that fear, was something that we found was really sort of egregious and appalling. And also, there were also school districts that did, and I think continue to retaliate against families, both against the parents as well as against children. We as an organization are structured as a membership association specifically for litigation purposes to protect parents' anonymity or students' anonymity in suits. So it's defending education versus a school district or a university, not Nikki and Rebecca versus a school district. When you're talking about issues of race, you're talking about issues of gender. Not everybody wants to have their name Googled in conjunction with those issues for all time, which I totally get. I think more people have realized, over the past 4 or 5 years, thanks to efforts of people, like Rebecca and everybody else, the sky is not going to fall if somebody calls you a name. But I think there was, at least in 2021, real, genuine fear. And then also we would hear about teachers singling out students. Johnny has to go in the library because Johnny's mom doesn't want him to learn about sex ed. And then it's sort of like there's that peer pressure element of shaming a child. And then the kid would go home and say, Mom, can I just do it? Like, can you just get over this? And like, can I just sit in the class? And so I think those as like kind of dirty tactics are something that we saw employed a lot. There were school districts that reached out to different employers and tried to get people fired. There was a school district in Michigan that had to pay a woman $156,000 because they got her fired. There was a superintendent in Scottsdale, Arizona that compiled a dossier of problematic families. And it was only revealed because he had it as a Google document that he didn't like secure and he sent a link to accidentally. But just, I mean, the fact that this is happening again with taxpayer funded school administrators is appalling. We have a right to dissent. And that's, I mean, this is probably most vividly, you think about Attorney General Merrick Garland doing his letter directing the FBI to investigate parents who spoke up at school boards. That's really scary. Nobody wants a knock on the door from the FBI. Like, I'm married to a constitutional lawyer, and I don't want that knock on the door, right? Like, that's terrifying. And that was used just to set an example and to shut people down. And so it is still, I think people are more brave now, and courage is definitely contagious. But we are not out of the woods at all. And I think, watching what has happened recently in the wake of Charlie Kirk, there is the heckler's veto. Oh, should you have that event? Do you want to express that opinion in public? This is, kind of the issue of our time, I think.
Yeah, very poignantly put. So, in your opinion, what types of support or resources are most needed right now to help prepare parents for the front lines, we could say?
Uh, I was scanning through some of the questions, and so in some way this may address it. But we started the conversation talking about school boards, and when parents are asking, well, what should we do about this school board person? And by the way, I got into this work. Nicole mentioned Fairfax County. It's where I used to teach. I got into this work because we had a school board member call Israel an apartheid colonizing state a few years ago when Israel was under attack by Hamas. This, predates October 7th. And we, gathered as parents to figure out what should we do? How should we confront the school board member? And what led from that was, discovering that there were all of these incidents of anti-Semitism. We got lawyers involved and everything. But what continued was, first of all, by putting the spotlight on the school board member, putting pressure on her, it wasn't just us, the Jewish community that was speaking up. It was Nicole. She was part of it too, and there were other parents across Fairfax County because this school board member had a lot to say about a lot of things that parents wound up not liking. It just did not settle well what her views were on the United States and a whole bunch of issues. And so we all stayed on her. and kept exposing what she was saying and kept getting it to the media. And so it got to the point when she was deciding whether to run for re-election, she decided she didn't want, the bother anymore. It was too much to deal with the constant pressure and the constant scrutiny of parent groups and other advocacy groups like Parents Defending Ed going after her constantly. So, in dealing with, these issues in K-12, we have to elect new school board members. And so that means that people are going to have to step up and run for the school board. We can't just hope that someone else will come in. We have to look within our own communities. And there's organizations out there, including mine, that support parents and help them with messaging and connecting them to organizations and funding and all that sort of thing. And to give you a success story in this, a couple of years ago, as I was, talking to a parent group, and there were issues with anti-Semitism, it was immediately after October 7th, and they were asking what they should do. And I said, when's your school board election? And it was, coming up in a few months. And I said, forget all of the incidents and issues, get somebody qualified to run and get them elected. And that's what they did. And so a year later, when that person is now on the school board and they had a budget shortfall, what this school board member did is he looked at the performance of every department, as he should as a responsible school board member, to see what it is, where the impact was and where the impact wasn't happening in each department. And of course, not surprisingly, found that in the DEI department, they were not having the impact that one might hope. Well, maybe they're having the negative impact that one might expect, depending on where you sit on this, but they were not having an impact on student learning, which obviously every department in a school should be impacting student learning in a positive way. And he was able to present that data to the rest of the school board. Mind you, they were not, politically aligned on these issues, and convinced them that they needed to cut the entire DEI department. This is unheard of in K-12. We're seeing it at the corporate level where there's been a shift, but, K-12 has like a death grip on these ideological concepts. And so they eliminated that office and used it to close that shortfall. So if one school board member elected can do that, think about when you have an opportunity where there's 2-3 seats available on your school board in a year. And if you got reasonable people elected who can balance budgets and can get set expectations of learning back in the schools, focus on reading and math and the other core subjects, you can make a difference pretty quickly, given the fact that this has taken years to take hold. So we do need to see more support for communities in running for school board elections. I think that's like the key area here.
Mm.
I am a child of the 80s, so I'm going to quote the cartoon I had to watch growing up because I had two brothers, G.I. Joe. At the end of every G.I. Joe cartoon, there was like a little life lesson where it was like, don't play with down power lines. But the line was like some like awesome G.I. Joe, like Snake Eyes, I would say something. It was knowing is half the battle. And so to me, that is part of it, is knowing what your rights are. Because when your district crosses those lines, and they will inevitably, or your children's rights, then you know that something has to happen. And it kind of forces people, policymakers, other parents to get off their butts. And so that can be anything from issues of racial discrimination, gender discrimination. Your child cannot be forced to, say that they are, going to atone for the sins of their forefathers because they were born with the wrong skin tone. They cannot be, forced to do a privilege walk. They cannot be treated differently on the basis of race, excluded from something, included for something. We have seen districts allocate money, for student programming based on, racial characteristics. That's not okay. That's a violation of federal law. But if you don't know that, then you're just going to be like, ugh, that's annoying. Like, why is there like this like Asian student club that has all this fun programming that my kid doesn't get to go to? So knowing your rights, I think, is super, super critical. And it's also, it doesn't, just if something's happening and you fear retaliation against yourself or your kid, you don't have to do it alone. I mean, I am always happy to jump on a grenade for somebody else. We have a tip line, so if we regularly hear from people and they check a box that they want to be anonymous, we will file a civil rights complaint. I will file, the FOIA that gets the documents. I will talk to Fox News and expose what's going on. So you don't have to do it alone, but there really is a very large community of people out here. It's like, I call it like the coalition of the normies, who are just a little bit sick of where America has gotten to at this point, right? This is not to say that it's like, we want to kick everybody out, all immigrant, it's not like it doesn't have to be super, super far afield. It's just, I just think it's weird for a public school official to tell a child to keep secrets from mom and dad. I mean, on issues of parental exclusion, which is something we have worked on, even if that message is geared towards supporting trans children, guess what? All kids hear it. When we had sued a school district in Iowa over parental exclusion policies a couple years ago, it turns out that that district actually had had 5 incidents of teacher on student sex over the past couple years before. I mean, that's really creepy. We as parents, when your kid's growing up, you always tell them, don't keep secrets from mom and dad. If somebody tells you to keep a secret from us, that's like a sneaky person. That's like a bad person. For that to happen to our children with our tax dollars behind our back is truly insult to injury. Um, and so I just there is as dark as it can seem sometimes, and as much hate as people who are sort of involved in this fight or might, think about getting involved in this fight, um, you know, know that they're going to face. At the end of the day, you have the Constitution on your side, you have the angels on your side, and you have morality on your side, and you have people like Rebecca and I on your side, which also makes it fun.
Yeah, I think what diving into this space has taught me is that parents can feel overwhelmed and like they have to reinvent the wheel. That's not the case. There are tons of people ready to teach them and onboard them and give them all the resources to help them start this process, like Camera Education Institute, like Defending Ed, and hook them up to local people in their area already doing this work. Because every district is a little different, handles things a little differently. There's probably already a movement brewing. And you just need to contact the right people and they can get you in connection. So that's why I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. Also, I just think that this accusation of, oh, this is like an anti-immigrant thing is so hysterical because in my experience, the people most passionate about fighting this are people from immigrant backgrounds who do not tolerate what is being taught to their kids, either on the basis of rigor and standards or because of the history of where they come from is being presented poorly, inaccurately, and even falsely. Um, like natural allies or any community that has a bad experience with communism, for example, they will get activated on this pretty quickly.
Yeah, and this
Um,
is not like a one size fits all, right? I mean, many people come at these issues from different areas. And like, groups that we work with that are good on gender are not always great on anti-Semitism. And people that like are good on anti-Semitism, like sometimes don't like our DEI work. And so I feel like the coalitions that we work with are constantly shifting. And I think people kind of need to be open to that as well. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of forward movement, right? The federal government is involved in this. Like there are people, like there is a much broader infrastructure than there was, when Rebecca and I were kind of getting into this fight many years ago. And I think, at the end of the day, you don't have to get out and be like a MAGA hat wearing person. You can get out and say, I just really want our kids to learn. I mean, you can look at US News and World Report and point to like, here are the proficiency levels in mathematics in our school for eighth graders. I mean, like the NAEP scores that come out every year from the federal government are dismal. And frankly, like even pre-pandemic, they were nothing to write home about. And so if you just go to your school board and say, I worry that we're not spending enough classroom time addressing and focusing on the basics and just saying, I demand a quality education. And that's like what you're pushing. That's the kind of thing that brings people together, right? It's not necessarily divisive on different, issues.
yeah. So I do want to take a few minutes to do some Q&A. We got so many questions this time, so I am going to have to be very selective. Um, Here's a good question. It's very specific. If my school knowingly violates presidential executive orders regarding education reform and DEI, Title IX, etc., or violates my child's or my own parental rights, what actions can I take?
Well, one thing about the executive orders is EOs do not carry the force of law. So that is, and we have seen a lot of school districts and states even, push back on that, which is, it's annoying. They're not wrong. And I think that is the charge for policy organizations like Camera and ours is that, okay, like let's codify these changes, right? Like let's make sure that the federal government is moving, is doing rulemaking, is passing laws. I saw there was a question there about moving on the Parents' Bill of Rights that had passed in last Congress, which has yet to be reintroduced in this Congress, which is a whole thing. But we have to make the changes stick. We don't want this administration to be like how President Obama said, with just a pen and a phone. So that's one thing. That being said, the federal like things that are taking place, the interpretations of Title IX, the federal government does have what's called, we all think back to constitutional law, the supremacy clause. Like they have oversight over spending, and districts, when they get federal money, have to sign off that they are not discriminating on the basis of race, on the basis of sex, and frighteningly, many of them are. Which is this is one of the reasons that we file civil rights complaints pretty regularly. The Department of Education is trying frantically to keep up and make examples of a few of these. But I think people are realizing, wow, this is going to be a really long 4 years if you're just trying to like sort of evade scrutiny, and that's pretty risky. I would not like mess around and find out with Pam Bondi. And so I think it is, yeah, depending on sort of what specifically it is, districts are trying to be too sneaky and they are not going to get away with it.
Yeah, we also have a very good question from one of our former panelists, Mr. Glenn Taubman. And so I'd like to share this with you guys. He asked, do you have any suggestions about what to do when teachers' unions devise an alternative curriculum, oftentimes anti-Semitic and pro-DEI, that tells teachers that they should ignore the school board's official curriculum and teach the union's alternative curriculum instead? Rebecca.
Well, in Massachusetts, where this has actually been a problem, where the Massachusetts Teachers Association had created a list of resources that went on and on that were each one was more anti-Semitic than the one before it, and there's a commission in Massachusetts, a legislative commission that has been investigating this, and they had a whole session on the MTA's resources that they were, suggesting teachers use. And of course, that's a way to kind of bypass, the school district. And, a lot of this just comes in through individual teachers anyway. What has taken place in Massachusetts, and actually the school board member that I referenced earlier started a process, and it started with his school district, but then it has also spread out to multiple other school districts, is that he drafted a resolution that stated that school districts were essentially saying, they weren't saying that the teachers could not use it, but that they were advised not to, and that kind of explained why that these resources were so problematic. And essentially, it's everything that Nikki and I have been saying during this, is that you've got to kind of put daylight on these issues. And so once you make something public, it obviously more people become aware of the problem, and so more people are now watching. And so now the school district has, this statement saying, okay, we're advising you against using these things. So if a teacher did go ahead and use them, which this is now where the parents come in, you've got to monitor what your kids are actually learning and what the resources are. And now you can take it to your school board. They have gotten a number of other districts across the state of Massachusetts to pass similar resolutions. So that's one method. Ultimately, when you've got these activist, union members, this is where the social media investigation is helpful, because a lot of them are very vocal. And so you'll know, like, oh my goodness, I have one of these very activist union members in my child's school. Well, you need to be keeping an eye on them, because obviously they're going to be bringing a lot of materials in. And so there's ways that we can expose what they are doing. If there's legal routes that we can take, obviously Glenn's organization is involved in some of those processes as well. There's lots of different allies here, just sitting in this webinar. Some of them we don't even know their names, but I know that they're present, that are involved in this fight, and we all work together.
Mm-hmm.
It is frighteningly difficult to fire teachers, like horrifyingly so, often because of the union contract that are with districts. And same thing at the university level. It's very, very difficult. And so one public records request we got back from Arlington, Virginia, was an English teacher that had taken the whole year to just talk about Israel and Gaza, the whole year. And I mean, I was reading emails from the principal to her saying, can you please explain how this links back to the state's ELA standards, right? But to have to build a case, like it has to be pretty documented, which is something that is deeply frustrating, because then I would see her forwarding emails to her personal accounts, and I knew she was clearly passing it on to some kind of legal organization, for her to sue the district and say that she had cause. So I think some administrators are sort of between a rock and a hard place, where they know there are these teachers that are not doing a quality job, but they can't do anything with. I mean, there was New York Magazine had a story about a decade ago about something called the rubber room in New York City public schools, where even if you are physically abusive to a child, you cannot be fired. You will just go to an administrative building and sit there, collect your full salary, on taxpayer, and so this is the kind of thing where, as Rebecca said, document, 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 just to show the utter unfitness. Because then, also as we see some of these districts where, eventually people say this is enough, and it sort of becomes untenable for the teacher. They then often try and move to other districts. And in something called, we see it sometimes in the sexual abuse setting, where districts do something called pass the trash. If an investigation is open but not concluded, there is no finding. So they will move to another state, they will move to another district and continue being a bad teacher. And so the more that this is documented, the more that it is publicized, these people's names are frankly going to be a little bit toxic and they will not be able to remain in the profession, ideally.
And I think it's also important to note, like that English teacher that Nikki mentioned, because that's something we worked on, was she's the daughter of a Hamas financier. So this is not, so you can understand why parents would be very, very concerned about coming forward with this, which is why we took the information, and I passed it on to Nikki actually. And so, but parents also need to understand too that while, sometimes we can't get immediate results, it doesn't mean that we're not continuing to work on it. And so some of these really egregious examples, there are things that are still ongoing in terms of investigations at the state, at the national level as well, that our organizations are part of and providing more information. So, parents on the ground need to continue providing the documentation so that we can then make the case to, law enforcement agencies and the such that, there's a real problem here that needs to be resolved. It takes time. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of time. And of course, we're talking about kids, which is why this is so, gut-wrenchingly difficult.
But I think there also have been state agencies that have said, they will start to consider revoking teaching licenses and stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, if you don't know how to get in touch with your state, Rebecca and I certainly will always be willing to track that information down and try and get that information in front of them.
After doing this and learning about the subject for so long, I would have thought that I, hear it all. But then speaking to our panelists every time, there's something where I'm just blown away. It's craziness. Well, I can't believe we've already run out of time. So I want to say thank you once again to our speakers, Nicole Neily and Rebecca Chagales, for sharing your insight and taking your time. If people want to find out more about you, we put some links in the chat. But please tell us, plug yourselves. Where can we find you?
You're welcome. Camera Education website, which is a department of the larger camera organization, which stands for the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. They can reach out to me. I saw there's lots of questions specifically about anti-Semitism. So if parents want to follow up, schools@camera.org. I will see the email and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can in the next week or so. So please reach out with questions and concerns.
Yeah, our website is defendinged.org. So we have lots of resources. We have our indoctrination map. We have engagement guides for people to sort of determine how they want to get involved, be it just passing a tip on to us anonymously or starting their own parent group or getting involved in a federal lawsuit or filing a civil rights complaint, whatever they might want to do. And I can also be emailed at president@defendinged.org.
Yes, this is why I love both of your organizations, because it's really soup to nuts. You can go in and learn and onboard and then you're ready. So thank you everyone for joining us. This was part of our 6-part series, Recapturing Liberalism in Education. These events are made possible by AHA's small but dedicated team and by supporters like everyone watching. So if you value these discussions and want to help us continue hosting them, please consider supporting our work at the ahafoundation.org/donate. We'll also share a link in the chat. And finally, we have our final episode, our final part of our series coming up on October 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern, titled Building Bridges, Unifying Perspectives for Depoliticizing the Classroom. And in that final section, we will hear from experts who are leading the charge to build coalitions across political spectrums to restore academic quality and affect national change. So if you want to learn more about this movement, this burgeoning movement, please join us on October 15th. And thank you again for being part of this conversation. And I hope everyone has a good weekend.